Kwesi, you had one question, briefly.
Yeah, thank you. Now, the question related to value chains and the fear that smallholder farmers could lose out, and what can we do to make sure that doesn't happen? I think there are lots of examples to show that smallholder farmers do not necessarily lose out of value chains. I've just, for the last 2-3 weeks, come from a tour in Uganda, and you happen to be Ugandan, I guess. Yeah, I came from a tour in Uganda where we went into a place where farmers had delved into producing soya beans. And one of my first questions is, do you have a market? And I was thinking they're going to tell me, oh, we'll take the soya bean to Kampala. Then they took me to another place where, through some private sector funding initiative, these farmers have aggregated themselves, and they now own a little mill. And they are processing the soya bean into livestock feed. And they told me the next step in their process is to actually make pellets out of that. Now, this thinking did not just come, out of the blue. It's just because there has been an innovation platform in which these farmers are members. And they have been challenged to basically link into these sort of processes. So I think it will take all of us, those of us either coming from the public sector organizations or coming from the development parties or from the research parties, to be minded that our key goal in this is to make sure that the smallholder farmers do not lose out. And I can assure you that through the innovation platform process, there are lots of examples. If you go to the website of FARA and you look at the innovation platform experiences, you will see lots of examples of smallholder systems that have really benefited through various value chain experiences and therefore having more income through the work that they have been doing. Thank you, Godfrey.
And lastly, Boaz, you had
yes,
one question.
To respond to that question, the private sector and the public sector as equal partners. If you go back to, on the continent, there are countries that interpreted structure adjustment program more than what it was intended to do. Some of these governments or institutions will always say, everything that is for the private sector and want to concentrate on where the governments are more comfortable rather than support, nurture, and strengthen the private sector to grow. To the extent that they're actually being left to limp. They are limping. The private sector is struggling to catch up. And yet, in other countries, especially where I've seen transformation happening faster, is where public institutions and governments have supported, nurtured, and strengthened the private sector to grow beyond where the markets are fading. So, in my view, is that especially those countries that embraced liberalization more than what it was supposed to be, they have tended to leave this work. In fact, the political economy of this particular one is that these countries now are beginning to reap from lack of public interventions. The private sector is just moving by its own self. Where governments have intervened is again to sweep out the private sector, especially in the area of subsidies. Rather than working through and supporting the private sector on specific inputs to nurture and grow the private sector, the governments are playing the role of the public sector. And in my view, largely to reap political gain rather than economic gains. And we are beginning to see the slow progress in this country than it would have been if the domestic, especially private sector, was supported, nurtured, and strengthened to operate economically effectively.
I don't want to prolong the session beyond the time allocated. Does somebody have one burning? I'll take one, and then we summarize. Now we'll have more. Oh yes, sorry. So I'm going to take the gentleman who was next, the Ugandan lady, and then I'll take another lady here, and Worako, you will be the last. So 3. And quick, short ones.
Okay. Merci, Monsieur le Président de la séance. Bon, on parle de questions d'alimentation, de nutrition et de création d'emplois. Mais j'ai l'impression que c'est un constat que je fais. L'impression que j'ai, on se focalise trop sur la question céréalière, oubliant une dimension importante qui est l'élevage et les acteurs de l'élevage. La majorité des chercheurs qui ont parlé ont abordé des questions extrêmement importantes, mais je n'ai pas vu apparaître à aucun moment la problématique de la transformation de l'élevage. Je pense que l'élevage est aussi un secteur, un moteur pour la transformation des productions végétales, à travers la fourniture de la mécanisation dont on parle. Les labours, à travers, disons, la pauvreté de nos sols, leur dégradation qui a été abordée par le professeur Kwesi, je pense qu'il y a la fumée des animaux. Et en matière de nutrition aussi, l'élevage joue un rôle important. Je pense que c'est un secteur qui, de mon point de vue, est un peu occulté. Je pense qu'il serait intéressant, dans les prochaines sessions de cette revue annuelle-là, que vraiment les chercheurs puissent apporter plus d'éclairage sur les dynamiques en cours dans la transformation de l'élevage et sa relation même à la transformation de l'agriculture. Voilà un peu un commentaire général que je voulais faire pour nous interpeller tous.
Thank you. Yes, the lady.
I'm Cindy Kiombe from Malawi, working with the Civil Society Agriculture Network. My question goes to Brown. One of the strategies you mentioned for economies to evolve into middle-income economies, you mentioned about the need to certify farmers. I just wanted to find out how that practically can be done, especially in an economy where you have the majority who are smallholder farmers, like the case of Malawi. How can you have certified farmers? And also the other question goes to Boaz. You mentioned about the need to protect domestic private sector. With the liberalization which we have, there are concerns in other sectors to protect domestic private sector. What's your take on that? And also, for example, in Malawi, in case of engaging private sector, it has been sort of difficult to have private sector involved in policy dialogue. They are invited to meetings, but usually it's not forthcoming. I want to find out how that can be improved. Thank you.
Thank you. And lastly, Warako.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Tadessa from Ethiopia. My question, the first question goes to Kwasi. In the strategy you mentioned the possibility of attracting users to agriculture as one of most important solutions. Also, I believe that is the most important one. But in many instances, if you ask any youth now in Africa, what do you want to be? He may say, I want to be pilot or a doctor, or no one say, I want to be a farmer. So maybe one is the issue of perception in our mentality is a serious problem. The other is strategy, policy, incentive package. So do you have anything which you suggest in order to attract more users to agricultural sector? I hope that is a key area in terms of transformation of agriculture. The second question is to Professor Von Braun. I'm a bit ignorant, but my question about hope for industrialization in Africa, how do you see? Because if we take most of Asian issues like Korean, the time and the period, the competition, completely different compared to today's environment. For instance, if we take textile sector in Ethiopia, it's very difficult to compete with Chinese imported textiles. They are much cheaper, much attractive, much, good compared to in many instances. So, in most other manufacturing goods as well. So, do you see any hope that African economy will, move in terms of manufacturing? Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Odese. I think the first comment, I don't think was really a question, but you are free to comment on it, that he didn't hear much discussion about the importance and role of livestock. So feel free to make comments on that. Otherwise, we'll begin with Joachim. I think you had two questions. One from Malawi and one from Ethiopia.
Just a sentence on the livestock question. Thank you for bringing it up. If you look at the Ethiopian leather and shoe industry and how it is connected to the livestock sector through the hides, etc., there you have an interesting industrial cluster plus value chains, which I think has tremendous opportunities. Cindy from Malawi, you're right, it's a huge task to train farmers to be excellent farmers. A trained farmer not necessarily needs to be a farmer in the future. Once you have had an applied vocational training, you can go into all sorts of different sectors. All I'm saying is that after primary education, the next step in rural areas should be a school system that facilitates on-the-job vocational training. These young women and men should be in school. It's a big investment, but the payoff of vocational training is huge. India is currently wrestling with that issue, to train more than 200 million farmers in a formal way. They also didn't do that investment. They thought they need to do the vocational training for the steel workers and others. And it took us also in Germany a long time to come to the conclusion that we shouldn't just train craftsmen in vocational training, but farmers, and the payoff is huge. So it's a cost-benefit calculation. I would recommend a country like Malawi should start with an experiment, with some experimenting. Maybe adjacent to Bunda College, vocational training for farmers, and see how it goes and do proper monitoring and cost-benefit. I bet it works and pays off. The industrial and manufacturing sector in Africa is confronted with really big competition. You are right. I hesitate to say that you need a carefully crafted industrialization or manufacturing strategy with some initial infant industry protection. I'm afraid it's necessary. We have learned it the hard way in my country, in Germany, after unification, with the dismantling of the industry structure in East Germany, that it, after the fact, required huge investment to rebuild some industrial core here and there, around which clustering could happen. So I think manufacturing cores can be created, and you have them. Whether textile industry is the right one, I would hesitate to say. But I mentioned already the shoe and leather industry is certainly one. But a modern agriculture with good food manufacturing connected to it, that's not rocket science. but you need to get the skills and exploit the location. The partly low energy price of Africa is a cost advantage. So I haven't done the research, but I agree with you, it needs to be done. But don't build up only protective walls without a strategy. Then you are doomed. Others have tried that before.
Thank you. Kwesi, you had one question?
Yeah, I'm really glad that the last contribution I make is on this subject of youth. Because believe it or not, I am also youth, at least at heart. And I do believe the youth challenge is a real big one. And there are good examples. There are real good examples. 3 years ago, the International Institute for Tropical Agriculture initiated an experiment of youth development. And they made use of young graduates who had finished their national service. And these were not even graduates of agriculture. Some are architects, some are in statistics, some are in agriculture, it's a whole diverse pool. So they finished their 1-year national service, and IITA started this experiment with the youth to sort of expose them to options for livelihoods through agriculture. But not necessarily the kind of agriculture where you have to carry a hoe. This is the kind of agriculture which is appealing to the youth, where they see that they can actually love it and also make money out of it. And that single initiative has blossomed. Right now, there is a set in Kenya, a set in Uganda. If you go on the website, just look at the IITA agripreneurs. They call them the agripreneurs. IITA agripreneurs. You go on Google, or you go to the IITA website. In fact, on the 8th and the 9th of this month in Montpellier, there's a huge meeting on youth based on this model, and it's been organized in the framework of the CGIAR with a lot of direct involvement of the Africa Development Bank and IFAD, basically looking at how a model like that can really be worked on. This original team, they are now consultants. They are moving into other youth programs and teaching the young ones how they can actually build on the models that have been established. So it is possible. And I think a lot of investment needs to be made in this regard to make sure that our young ones can see what is exciting, looking across the entire value chain. And I'm really excited by it, and I believe there are great things that could come out of this whole process. Thank you.
And lastly, Boaz, you had 2 short questions: how to protect the domestic private sector, and also how to bring the private sector to be more interested in policy dialogue.
Yeah, I think on the protection of the domestic private sector is the right thing to do. One, the premise is that you can allow investments to happen, and they are going to happen anyway. But we're also coming from the fact that, especially learning from the last 10 years of implementation of CADAP, that there has been phenomenal growth in most of the countries, agricultural growth. But most of this growth has not been inclusive. So if you allow investment to happen without providing specific policy incentives, policy actions that can bring the smallholder farmers as part of the private sector, but also small and medium enterprises to be protected for development rather than against, it's the right thing to do, and it's the role of government anyway to make sure that you provide specific policy packages that allow the domestic and other actors to be part of that inclusive growth. Otherwise, they could be crowded out, as I mentioned earlier. On how specifically the policy dialogues can be more inclusive again, previously the discussion was around how policies are set, how policies are formulated, were largely driven from what the public sector thinks should be the right policy for attracting private investment. But today we are seeing more private sector actors being part of the dialogue. But I think for me the challenge is on the way you facilitate or engage the dialogue itself to happen. If you bring the private sector actors in the dialogue space and only allow public sector institutions to provide guidance, messaging, directions and directives, and then at the end of the day you say you have been inclusive because they were only participating, then that's not an effective public sector, private sector partnership and dialogue. But we are seeing, I think, a few changes happening on the continent, and they are starting with specific actors like specific seed or fertilizer producers, shaping and dictating on the nature type of policies that should be formulated, allowing and giving the strong space for the small and medium enterprises, private sector to be part of designing the nature and type of policies that should be instituted. And the examples are already happening on the continent.
Okay, thank you very much. So let me summarize, and this is a job I don't like, because everybody who is a part of the panel, you pick your own messages. And so I don't want to dilute what you picked, but let me give only 4 that I picked for myself. 1 from each of the panelists and 1 from the audience. So from Professor von Braun, I think he started off on a topic that was not a subject of this discussion. This is population migration. And what he suggests is that we need to have an open dialogue between Africa and Europe on this question of population migration. From Boaz, I picked that we need to have a genuine and frank discussion between the government or between governments and the private sector, especially on constraints that are limiting investment in agriculture. From Kwesi, the message I picked is the need for investment in strategic breeding, especially for technologies that are going to help address the emerging challenges of agricultural diseases and climate change. And from the audience, I picked this issue around youth in agriculture. Youth moving out of agriculture, and then sentimentally us hoping that they can go back. So I think there is need to do research on this subject to understand the motivating factors that drive youth out of agriculture, and then look for incentives that may attract the youth back to agriculture. So I think research is needed for us to understand that phenomenon very well. So those are the 4 take-away messages I picked for myself. You picked your own. And that brings us to the end of this session. So can you join me to thank the panelists, please? Yes. Thank you very much. And because of that, you are all invited to a cocktail, which I think is happening upstairs where we had lunch. So it is happening starting, I think, now. And then tomorrow, you need all to be back early and sharp. We'll begin at 8:30 in the morning. And you have the program with you. So enjoy the cocktail responsibly and be fresh in the morning. Thank you very much. And good night.